So I'll try and make this really quick in terms of a little background here. I have a MacBook Pro, which I normally operate on day to day with booting Windows, and I also have a Slate tablet. The Slate went belly up running Windows 10 on Wednesday. Last night at about 9 p.m., my MacBook Pro Windows side went belly up. And point of interest, if you have a Windows 8 or Windows 10 machine that's on a domain, you cannot do a system restore with a normal user account or a domain account. And I found that fascinating.
Do you know where to put them?
Completely made system restore button because I had no local admin, true like non-domain local admin. Very frustrating. And I thought I had a bio over here. Anyways, my name is Greg Levenhagen. Microsoft MVP and Windows Platform Development, I think is the name now. I run a conference called That Conference. You can check it out called thatconference.com. That's actually the name, That Conference. And go around the nation speaking and have a lot of fun engaging with you guys. So I want this to be a discussion. By no means is this a presentation that's just me talking, right? So whatever your experiences, questions are, just either raise your hand or interrupt me if I'm in the middle of something going too far. Since I had my laptops, both of them crash, I'm not going to bore you guys with any slides since they're now gone. So basically the idea was to spend most of the time in Visual Studio showing you what I've found for doing debugging and performance diagnostics types of things. Touch a little bit as well going outside of Visual Studio, but that's more about like integration points rather than actual development stuff. All right, so how many of you are regular Visual Studio users? Is anybody new here? I know there's a diverse background of conference attendees. So. All right, so when we look at Visual Studio, today we're in Visual Studio 2013, and the edition is Premium. And so the first thing to recognize is that depending on what version you're in, it makes a difference. So with Premium, that's kind of the middle of the stack. And for the short term, this is going to be a potential issue depending on what features you want. I'll cover some of those. In the long term, as in probably only like 6 months out, Microsoft has announced that they're merging Visual Studio Ultimate and Visual Studio Premium, and that is not it's not making it more expensive. It's essentially the same price or even a little bit cheaper by a couple $100, so that if you're on Premium, you'll now get all the features of Ultimate, and you just stay at Premium. So the real takeaway though for you guys is if you have any licenses that you bought at the Pro level, within the next 3 weeks, it might be 2.5 weeks by now, upgrade your Pro licenses because it's dirt cheap to upgrade them to Premium. Then you will automatically be grandfathered in at Enterprise, the new SKU. All right. So when we start out with looking at some code, I've got a WPF app in here and a web app. So we can bounce back and forth between them as needed for some of the features. How many of you are predominantly on the web stack? Okay. Anyone do a desktop stuff? A little bit? Okay. So I'll try and stay more on the web stack side, then be a little bit more relevant for you guys. Basically, what we're going to start out with doing is we've got our normal basic kind of controller, and say that we have some kind of bug within our code. You know, I listen to, so I live in Wisconsin. Yay, you guys can give me all the jokes, whatever you want.
What part?
What's that?
What part?
I spent 9 years in Milwaukee, now I live in the suburb. So, but I grew up here in Palatine, the northwest suburb, so bounce around a little bit. But as I was driving into Chicago today, I listened to a couple different podcasts. I went searching for ones on debugging diagnostics, get my head, engaged for this. And one of the guys said he's been going around helping people for a career with figuring out debugging problems and sometimes performance problems. And he said the majority of people he runs into actually don't need advanced debugging techniques. They need just normal best practices, which I found kind of shocking. But maybe that is. So I'm interested where your guys' experience are, because he said a lot of people won't even spend time looking at a call stack. A lot of people won't even set a breakpoint and try and debug when they get an error in the actual UI. They'll actually just take the error, copy, paste it into Stack Overflow or Google. And I'm curious to see, like, is that kind of the culture that some devs are going towards? Like, I find myself looking at the code first. Like, generally speaking, I would think you're going to have an idea of where that is or what's going on. I could see, like, if you're taking over somebody else's code in maintenance mode, maybe going that as a first route. There's absolutely nothing wrong with going to the web to search. I mean, that's just part of being today's developer. There's so much to memorize that it's more about knowing where to problem solve than it is memorizing stuff. So let's start out with breakpoints, one of the basic types of tenets here that we have. So we all know that we can click on the left margin, and we can also hit F9, turn them on and off, right?
It's still the same.
Raise a hand, anyone here ever customized their breakpoints? Okay, decent amount, nice. So what I often find, and there's about half the people in the room didn't raise their hand, is that it gets overlooked for the options of customizing breakpoints. So we can of course set them, disable them, delete them. But when we look at location, condition, hit count, filter, when hit, and we can then even label them. One of my favorites to use is the when hit. So when we look at this, we get a nice little pop-up, grayed out by default. If I select the print a message, I get some default stuff in there. So we see some environment variables. A lot of times I'll end up just deleting those because I know where it should be coming from, and that can be a little bit of extra cruft on the printouts. But where this really matters is if you start doing some async and multi-threaded stuff. Then you really need to pay attention to where stuff's coming from. So before we dig into the message a little bit more, there's a continue execution. What this will do, though, is it'll take all of the output of whatever we specify in the text box and send it to the output window. Because I end up using this feature a lot in terms of when I'm looking at new code and doing code reviews and I want to know what's happening, I don't want to change the production code ever, right? There's the ultimate fallback for us as developers is to start doing, if you have C++, it's printf. If you're doing console apps, it's console.writeline, response.writeline for web apps. But what we're doing there is we're writing non-production code in our production code just to debug it. Well, that usually doesn't have side effects, but you always have to go back and delete it, right? So this is a replacement for that kind of functionality. And we don't have to break on them either. We don't have to set stuff, right, with that continue execution. Well, what's really nice about this is any values that I can have it interpreted and printed. So the syntax is pretty simple in that I can just say like X is, and then inside of any curly brackets, it'll actually be evaluated as an expression. So if I say X equal true, it'll evaluate that, and if it's just X like this and it's an integer, then it'll spit out the integer, like say 23, right? And if you're processing over a loop of stuff, right, querying a bunch of records out of a database and you want to know what's what, you can see as that all gets read and printed out. So this can help you understand what some of the data is that you're looking at. Said cancel on that, go back to a conditional count. So what we look at here is something I was hinting at with the last one, when we're interested in maybe the 95th entry, right? And we know that out of our set that's coming back from 100, here's where we can actually do something specific. So either whether the value has changed, like on a conditional sense, or is true. So when we evaluate that expression of saying like, okay, whenever the ID is 37, and I'm going through some big business workflow, I want to be able to break on just when it's 37, right? How many of you guys, and be honest, how many of you have sat there and hit F5, F5, F5? Only one person. I've done it, right? You've done it until you hit the right one. It's kind of a pain. So I use those two a lot. We also have location, so we can say when it reaches code within a certain file and line. I don't find that this is all that useful for myself. I don't know if anyone has ultimately used it themselves. Has anyone found a good use case for this? The file breakpoint type thing? Okay. We can look at hit count, and really when we look at the options that are here, the break always, break when hit count is equal to, break when hit count is in a multiple of. So basically it's like a modulus type thing. Instead of doing a print every like modulus 20, so you can kind of get a progress status of how something's going, right? This can help us out on that level. In particular, I find myself using this against large data streams. So I'm sure there's a session here or yesterday on IoT, right, Internet of Things, where we start talking about massive streams of data, and you're worried about analytics, right? Well, if you're trying to debug on that, I mean, I may be getting like, 10,000 records coming in per second. Well, I can't visually consume all that, right? So when I look at this type of breakpoint, it makes it a lot easier. In my day-to-day life, I occasionally do some stuff with clients on the Connect, with a KI, right, for Microsoft with hand stuff. Well, those have constant streams of data. So I'm usually only ever interested in, like once per second instead of 60 per second times 10 different feeds. It's too much, right? So that can definitely be valuable. And we look at a filter as well. So here we can restrict a breakpoint with whether it's different threads or processes, along with a couple other different ways to handle that. How many of you guys have ever done multi-threaded stuff? How many like doing multi-threaded stuff? That's about right. Yeah, usually about half the people don't. I'm one of those guys that likes it, gals, whatever, that likes it, but it can be challenging, right? What's the challenge with trying to debug multi-threaded?
I mean, if you're trying to find a race condition, or it can get hard to have your breakpoint sign up, or if, and in the older Visual Studios, debugging is just when you're trying to step through the different threads, one step at a time in this thread, and then one step at a time in that thread. It's
right. Well, and what I'd like to highlight is really there's two scenarios. And so I've tried to do, actually, up in Minneapolis, I did a talk once on advanced multi-threaded stuff. And trying to even do a demo for a presentation is very difficult to get it back to a reproducible state. We'll look at some of those as well. Hopefully that plays out well. But in particular, there's two things to pay attention to. One is the difficulty in threading isn't in the coding, isn't in actually having multiple executions going on at the same time, concurrently, whatever. The difficulty is in merging the RAM. So think about that. If I have 1,500 threads going on, if I never have to merge the results, there's no problem in it. It's only ever when I have state that's calculated in each of these that then somehow need to be merged. What makes graphics easy, so like if we look at a graphics card and we're trying to debug what's going wrong, graphics card, say, has 4 GPU chips on it, right? If we put a nice coordinate system in the middle, well, we can take that top left quadrant, put it on one, take another one, put it on another. As far as the merging is concerned, we just align them. So it's technically not really merging the data. So it's super easy to do graphics. It's super easy to process individual records that are non-relational. But a lot of times our line of business apps are relational, that becomes difficult. The other thing is you can't predict what the CPU is going to swap in and out of RAM, right? So one thread may get 10 seconds on the first run, and then the second thread starts, and you run that again, and the thread A only runs for 3 seconds, and then thread B starts. So that's where we run into a lot of difficulties there. This can help us at a basic level of, of understanding where things are coming from when the breakpoints are actually hit. Labels I don't really find all that useful, but we can indeed also export our breakpoints. I've only actually done this in practice to see what it's like. I've never really found myself in a situation where I need it. The one where I would imagine it's useful is if I'm going on vacation or for a weekend and a remote worker in another state or another country needs it. and I'm going to say, here's where I left off, and I already had a bunch of things configured that I can then pass on those breakpoints, and it's an easier transition. Okay, so we looked at, I started talking about multi-threaded stuff, so let's move into that scenario. Before we can, the first thing to realize is the debug, windows, and then options here are nothing compared to what's actually there when we're in a debug state. I don't know why Microsoft did this. It's arguably so that it's easier for you. One thing to keep in mind is that when we start up the settings in Visual Studio, and you have a choice between like web developer, C# developer, JavaScript, or general, whatever. None of those actually enable or disable features in Visual Studio. All it does is change around the menus and options. So if this looks different than what you're used to, it's probably just because you have a different location of where that's stored or a different shortcut, because if you pick something that's a primary different focus for you. So if we now try and, let's make sure our web project is set to start. And run. Okay, so we hit the breakpoint. So let's first just understand what we all have available here. So now we have breakpoints, output, GPU threads, right? Kind of some general ones looking at. Then we've got a whole new section that's new with Visual Studio 2013 on tasks, parallel watch. As the gentleman up here in the front was stating, before that it was very difficult to see, to try and debug on that. In these cases, again, the demo, if we have time, maybe I'll code up something that'll try and trigger those. But what those do is allow for some visual understanding of what's going on. We actually will see like, okay, here's our main thread, and then if I've got 3 threads coming off of it, we'll actually see like a line in a diagram sense to thread A, thread B, thread C. And you can actually then, when you're hitting breakpoints on those, it'll actually highlight that so you'll see the current path of what's currently being handled. Under the covers, what's really nice that's happening is you have the option of making all threads break at once, right? Because in the past, you may hit a breakpoint in thread C, thread A and B would continue. And so processing, to get a true snapshot of that becomes difficult. We have some of the more traditional ones here with watch, autos, locals, and immediate. Is everyone familiar with those? We're going to look at them a little bit, but right, these have been around since 1996-ish or so when Microsoft took them from Borland. We have a JavaScript console and a DOM Explorer. I'm sure if you guys are predominantly web stack, you're used to looking at JavaScript console, DOM Explorer. We'll dig into some of the specific web techniques of debugging as well. We'd also see call stack, threads, modules, processes. Processes I used to do more around the year like 2000, where we had a lot more COM and stuff like that. I don't tend that I'm using too many external processes. Finally, at the bottom, we've got memory, disassembly, and registers. That's like hardcore stuff, right? How many people get into that? Yeah? What's your use case for them?
It's very rare.
It's very rare, but yeah. So, yeah, when it comes down to like looking, if I'm doing C++, it's definitely more of a thing. But if I'm doing C# or VB.NET, not so much. But kind of like WinDBG, the WinDebug.exe that's like becoming a ninja in your own right, learning how to use that tool. All right, so when we look at this, let's dig into, got some windows on the bottom already open here. Right, so from an autos perspective, what this nicely does is, Tim, I'm going to totally screw up some of your stuff.
That's all right.
You'll have to reset things. All right, so our autos window allows us to see what's currently in scope. So wherever the breakpoint is currently hit, right, if we're inside of a method, if we're at a class level variable with static, we're going to see whatever is automatically determined by the compiler by the .NET runtime. Now, because I don't have access to Visual Studio 2015 right now, I'm going to have to talk about some of the features that are coming up. Has anyone played around with VS 2015 yet? It is in release candidate mode. I don't think Microsoft's made an official date, but it should be this summer. Rumors stated at about the July timeframe. Some of the things with autos, local, and watch are going to be improved quite a bit. So I would imagine that a decent amount of you have had experience with Entity Framework and or using Link to look at data. Well, have any of you guys ever tried to go through the autos or the local or watch window with Link? What do you get? What's a gold star?
Can't express lambda.
Can't express the gold star. All right, you can't express the lambda, right? It gives you a little circular icon, and it says, you know, expression can't be evaluated or something during runtime without side effects, right? And it sucks. So you're not going to have that option in the autos. The local here, similar type of stuff that we get out of this. But if we go to the watch window, where we specifically have stuff that we are interested in, and the watch window, a little bit different from the autos and locals in that those are just going to show us what the runtime is determining. The watch window is specifically looking at changes, right? So as passes occur or as you run through different data sets, you're going to see differences there. So if we go back to our home controller and we look at watch, of course I didn't stick anything in there. So let's hit stop. So if we say var x is equal to new list of int and whoops, trying to be too fast. Okay, we did this, and now we hit start. Back down. Now, if we look at the watch, we can sit here and say X, right? And right-click on it, add watch. And there's also a parallel watch, which I'm not going to really be able to demo to you, but we can see that in a normal array or non-link expression that it's going to work. Well, in Visual Studio 2015, the evaluating of lambda expressions within the watch window is now a thing. It's going to automatically allow you to do that.
Right.
Yep.
Is there more than one thing you want to show in 2015? Well, they've got it on this.
No, we're already 20 minutes in. That's fine. Yeah, there are some other things I'll point you to there, but take them as takeaways. I look at that as, you know, when your boss or whoever it is saying, well, why should I upgrade? You know, I think that right there is going to be, on a day-to-day level, I end up using Entity Framework and Link against objects so much that I think that that's going to help me in debugging alone right there. So, you know, keep a list of some of the stuff we discussed today is why should I upgrade? Hey, if you need justification, right? But if you have MSDN, you get the upgrade regardless, right? Okay, so watch, go back up here. We look at the call stack. One of the things that I find often happens in the call stack is simply an overlooking of what's actually happening in terms of a bug. Right, so I had, a couple weeks ago, I was running a give camp, and I had a team of 5 people that had no idea what was crashing. Now here, we happen to see our code at the top. But all this other kind of grayed out code, right, symbolizes that it's somewhere in the framework or a third-party type thing, not our code. And a lot of times, the breakpoint was going to hit up here, or an exception stack trace is going to be up here. And the call that you have actually made on in terms of user code may not be black or bold and be somewhere in the middle. So just as a reminder, please always look back at that and look at what you're calling. You know, a very common scenario is you call something and then it goes through a call stack of like 5 to 10 other calls within the framework and ends up being null from whatever you passed in. But it looks like, oh, that might be a bug in the .NET framework or a bug in the library. No, probably not. I mean, like, you may be doing that, but the .NET framework at this point in time, it's pretty stable, right? Like, you can do some searching. Maybe if you're using preview software, you might find something, but definitely pay attention to that call stack. It's often overlooked. And I actually came out of debug mode. All right. So we come back here. I also want to show you that we have the ability for performance and diagnostics. With this, we actually get a window. How many people have run this? Yeah, not too many. Okay, so that's usually what I find. But this is baked right into your Visual Studio instances. It should be under like diagnostics or something, but instead it's under this analyze dropdown. So under the analyze dropdown, we see performance diagnostics as well as a profiler. We can do, one of the big things about performance isn't just looking at where you are right now, but it's where you've gone, right? Like, have you increased the page speed, load speed by 100 milliseconds over the last month, or have you been increasing it, right? So when you look at your overall application as it's growing, teams that are concerned about this end up over time, like over a month, tracking that in terms of their continuous integration. So just like you would regularly schedule unit tests or integration tests, you can have your performance runs on analysis so that you're tracking, hey, what likely just made this page load 500 milliseconds longer, right? So don't think that that's beyond the realm of possibility as well. Before I move on that, one little trick that I often find nice is that, some people will say there's only like 6 or 7 software engineering principles. Some will say there's 13. Whatever you want to decide on, when you're working on any project, what I find successful is to say, okay, here's a list of the 10 of them, and I need the product owner of the ultimate business decision maker on this to prioritize those in a list, and nothing can be the same prioritization. And so what I'm talking about there is performance, maintainability, reusability, robustness, scalability, right? All those various things that we've all heard about, right? And if number one is performance, well, then you need to focus on that, right? You want to battle between premature optimization with diagnostics and whatnot, but it's something that should be concerned. A lot of times you're going to find performance more towards the 7, 8, 9, 10, and you're going to have like maintainability or whatever is near the top, but something to pay attention to. So when we look at this, we can say analysis target. If I change this, hit the change target type to see what's available. Not everything can be analyzed and put diagnostics against. So we can say use the startup project, which will work with the WPF and the web. We can also look at the next two that are Windows Store apps. What's interesting about what's coming with Visual Studio 2015, and likewise at the same time there'll be a new Microsoft Store. That new Microsoft Store is going to allow for WPF and desktop apps to be in it, and you'll even be able to have enterprise stores, like so just your company has a store out in the cloud. So why wasn't there 15 years ago for us? How many of you guys have downloaded paint.net? Okay. Do you remember the web page for downloading paint.net? It's like such a confusing experience. Anyway, sorry. It has like 14 links on it. Well, not 14, and like you don't know if you're downloading spam or something else, right? So the fact that we've got them in these stores, so these Windows Store apps essentially mean that they're .appx files, where there's a whole package, right? We can attach to running ones. We can launch already installed ones to try and debug them from like a remote type session, which is nice. We can look at the browser when it's running on Windows Phone. Don't necessarily disregard what that means. Like if you're just trying to do responsive stuff for your web, that very well may work, even if you're targeting Android and iOS, right? Executable, we know about that, as well as ASP.NET, right? So let's just leave it at the startup project. We have, or let's change it to ASP.NET. Right? If we have the performance wizard, which allows for CPU sampling, instrumentation, .NET memory, and resource. What's not applicable right here are the things that are down below. They depend on what we're looking at. So like WPF one with XAML UI responsiveness, some of the JavaScript memory utilization. This has only been added to in terms of Visual Studio 2015. So I know a lot of you aren't doing XAML stuff, but on the JavaScript side, big increases there in terms of helping you figure out what's happening both server side as well as then like in terms of spa scenarios, right? If you're doing Angular JS apps, of actually recording the JavaScript and getting that back into a readable fashion inside of Visual Studio. That's a big deal, right? Like the only real thing out there now is some third-party things like Track.js. You can use application insights from Microsoft or New Relic, which will help you with that client-side debugging. But that really does take us outside of Visual Studio in that case. Not necessarily a bad thing. So if we hit, I gotta get out of the debugging session here. And now forgetting, there it is. So here we get to make our choice of which profiling method we would like to do. So a CPU, instrumentation, which really is about what functions, like do I have one function being called 98% of the time? Well, in terms of debugging and performance and diagnostics, you should really focus on that one, right? But a lot of times that gets overlooked, and that's the whole gotcha of premature optimization there with code. So we hit next. We can select which project we want to do. So we have the web project. We hit next. Launch profiling wizard automatically. So as this pops up and comes into a state, what we get here, I've got a basic one with no authentication turned on, and I can click around, hit different things on here, contact, whatever, learn more. I think that takes us away from our page, right? And ultimately then, we should be able to hit stop on this. So now it says stopping data collection, collecting runtime data, merging that data collection. So we get into, on the left-hand side, where the default location is, we've got a web application 1 for the sampling of the performance, and profiling complete. So now, if I, had a bunch of different people hitting it at the same time, or was doing something a lot more relevant, like, my about page called in a whole bunch of JavaScript and had a couple errors and all this stuff, we would start to see like some big spike when I was calling that, right? It helps us know where we need to actually further diagnose, further debug, where we can dig into that. There's all kinds of filters here as well. And then we can generate reports, if you've got to report those up towards management or whatever it may be. All right. As far as websites go, as long as you have not connected, and that should be okay. Can I expand app service, or is there anything proprietary in there?
You're fine.
Oh, okay. So under app service, if you're connected up to anything out in Azure, is anyone hosting their websites they're creating up in Azure? Why not? It's so much easier than like GoDaddy or whatever it may be. So, but if you have your own servers, that's fine, whatever. But yesterday I was working on an app that's an Angular app in an MVC project, and I had a separate project within the same solution running Web API. And what Angular is doing is calling to the other project, and it has to be authenticated. Well, none of the developers working on this project really were concerned about it, so they just went and enabled CORS, which allows for cross-domain authentication calls, right? And I'm like, okay, it's time to deploy this, and I'm the tech lead on this, and I was working on some other things, so I go in and I deploy them to 2 separate websites in Azure. They're under the same subscription, everything else. You'd think, okay, they should play well together. No, right? And I'm like, okay, great. So it's an environmental issue because I can run it locally and it's fine. Environmental, I deploy it, it doesn't work. Instead of having to try and figure that out in a very complicated, old school kind of way with maybe deploying it with debug constants or output statements or the trace at the bottom, like on web forms pages, right? All that kind of stuff that we used to have to do. In Server Explorer, I can connect up to these. So under App Service, if you're connected up to a subscription, you just hit expand on that. You see all your websites that are listed. I can right click and just say attach debugger. I have the source code open on my Solution Explorer for what's currently there, whatever branch is deployed, and I literally was able to debug and hit breakpoints and get the exceptions out of that.
Craig, if you click on storage, that might be connected.
On storage? Well, development at least, but yeah, so like, but if there's, you'd see the same, similar type thing where you'd see like, you know, Greg's lame app, and I could just right click, hit it, and then it's just like debugging right off of that. Now,
if it's compiled for release mode.
even if it's compiled for release mode, I had it compiled in release mode because I was going out to, that was our staging environment, right? Our debug and test were local. So even if you're in that mode, well, there's also even a more advanced approach that you can take when debugging with that. I can't show you that, but in the enterprise SKU of Visual Studio, or if you currently have Ultimate, you get IntelliSense, and IntelliSense is an absolute, I'm sorry, not IntelliSense, IntelliTrace. IntelliTrace is an absolute beast of data collection. I do not recommend running it against production. So it will literally record every call stack entry, every parameter change, everything in there. What that allows you to do, because when we look at breakpoints, you can drag and drop breakpoints, right? So like you're inside of a method, you're down here, you drag it up. Well, IntelliTrace allows you to do that from anywhere within your application. So you can replay it and be guaranteed you're going to hit that same exception, which is really cool. But when you go into the Azure portal under a website, you can sit there and say, one of the options is say, enable debugging of this, where it'll define all those debug constants and inject them into your code. And it has an auto timeout switch, I think, at 48 hours, so that you can't accidentally leave it on, which is a good thing. But then what you have to do in order for that to actually work, same thing. You come into Server Explorer, you go out to like your app service, and then you see the website, and when you right click, instead of, well, you'll also see attached debugger, but you'll see a download IntelliTrace stuff. So then you can download that and view that, and it gives you a nice report, and then you can run that against it and see exactly what was happening. So it's I've only had to use that 2 or 3 times over the last maybe 2.5 years, but when that's needed, that is a tremendous saver. In the same fashion that I was able to just attach the debugger and learn, okay, I've got a CORS cross-domain issue for authentication, right? I probably would have spent 4 or 5 hours, you know, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, I don't know, a lot longer than when I just right-click and do that from a debugging scenario.
So is this kind of like black box?
You mean like as a black box, like data in, data out, we don't know what's in the middle?
No.
No.
There's product.
Oh, a product of black
Yeah.
box. I'm not familiar with that. What does that do?
It basically does data collection on the server side of everything that happens, so that you can step through.
Nice. Yeah, IntelliTrace sounds similar to that. And that's built in. And again, you'll get that with, if you have Premium or Ultimate, you'll get it with what is currently Premium in a couple months. All right. I got to think in my head what my next step on. Oh yeah, options. Options instead. You got a question? Okay, so by default, I think it's by default, the enable just my code is actually checked. If you are interested in knowing what else is going on, you can uncheck that, so then you're going to start catching exceptions within the framework. And I believe also, trying to think of how that works with the JavaScript actually. I think the JavaScript is going to be treated as just your code regardless. But that's something to pay attention to. Another thing here is looking at the symbols directory. So when you're interested in actually figuring out, is this really a bug in Entity Framework or me? You can actually use the Microsoft symbol server, or if you have your own custom servers, hook it up, and then it asks you to specify a directory. So usually I make like a C:\symbols or something. And then I usually suggest only specific modules that you're interested in, because otherwise that can end up being gigs and gigs of data that you end up downloading over time. And it does make your overall debugging experience slower. So it's probably something that you don't want to necessarily leave on a day-to-day basis. From the, there's another thing here I wanted to show. If you're doing WPF or Silverlight, if anyone's maintaining Silverlight at this point, or you're making Windows Phone or Windows desktop apps, this data binding warning is often a newbie type thing when you're learning XAML, that it'll just provide a warning in the output window. It doesn't give you a compilation error. It doesn't give you a runtime error. So you can go in and change this. The default is warning, and that'll actually let you know, hey, this is why I'm not seeing data on my screen. And projects and solutions. This little guy. If you have issues, the default is minimal. I've often found that although we think that we get a decent amount of output in the output window, it is by no means a lot. And there are certain messages that you will only see when you're in detailed or diagnostic. So I would imagine a lot of you are hopefully using NuGet. Is that the case? Yeah. So I've run into scenarios when I'm working in a multi-team environment with NuGet, and different people are uploading different packages at various times. And sometimes those NuGet packages can edit the MS build targets. So when you end up getting conflicts in those, and hopefully not many merge conflicts, but just more or less reference conflicts on versions, like, you know, somebody includes Log4Net 2 and somebody includes Log4Net 2.1 in a different project. Well, the only way that you actually get to see that that level of output when you're doing a build is under the detailed. That also increases your build time because it has to write so much text, and I mean it's a lot of text. Yeah, we may as well just show you. Okay. So if we go to detail there, we say rebuild solution. Oh, of course, it's because I have like no code. Did I not hit save? This is what we say?
I don't think you set it to detail.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, okay.
I did, but there's just not enough code because these are just empty. But if you've got a decent amount of code, it clearly takes for like a long time. But okay, so last little tidbit that I really wanted to make sure I got to before any questions is really around two things really. One, load testing, which is not part of this topic here in terms of debugging diagnostics, but load testing can help you find out a lot of interesting information along the diagnostics route. You will get that available with Visual Studio 2015 now. It's not just an ultimate type thing anymore. So that's something that you can definitely dig into. The nicest thing about those load testing is the web performance tests are very easy to do. So basically all you end up doing is saying, in a normal like unit test type project, instead of saying, give me a new unit test class, you say, give me a new web performance test class, and then you can say record. It'll pop open a browser. You'll be able to browse around like you would think that's a normal business workflow, and all those individual calls against your web server get called. The JavaScript ones don't, right? Like JavaScript in the page does not get called. Any AJAX requests that you make back to the server do get recorded, right? So it's only really server-side back and forth kind of communication. But then you can go record, say, 4 or 5 of those normal workflows, right? Somebody logging in, an HR person going and doing this, staff are going and doing something different. Excuse me. And then you can replay those, and you can get all kinds of exceptions because every little detail is recorded, and they get stored into a SQL server for you to go look at and evaluate. Yeah, the last piece. I mentioned them a little bit before, but when we're starting to look at web projects, a lot of interesting tools that we can add through NuGet. So some of these, if we look at application insights, might be one word to see. hopefully the internet's working here. Yeah, there we go. Right, so we get an application insights.diagnostics package. Has anyone heard of App Insights yet? Okay, only a couple. Have you guys heard of New Relic or Raygun? No? Okay. So this is a great topic for you guys to really dig into. Okay, when there was a question before about how do you want to have your website running in debug mode the whole time? No, because that slows down things, right? But Application Insights, New Relic, Raygun, are all, and there's other ones as well. But what they do is they're smart enough when they're running on your web server, they can also inject some JavaScript. And so it's smart enough on both the client side and the server side that if you start running into optimization issues, that it's going to start caching the data locally rather than continually sending it out. And then if you hit a certain threshold, like say 85% utilization on CPU or 90%, it just stops recording or stops gathering stuff. Now you may think, well, that's bad, but what it's trying to do is be respectful so that your application doesn't experience an actual outage at that time, right? What all of these tend to do then, so like Microsoft App Insights will push it out to an Azure portal instance. What New Relic will do, New Relic's kind of expensive, I think it's like $150 per app per month. They'll push it out to their servers. Raygun does the same thing. Raygun is really more specific on unmanaged exceptions. So like if you've ever heard of something like Elma, that it's kind of like a more modern day approach to that where you can roll up and seed in a lot easier fashion.
It ain't cheap though.
What's that?
Raygun ain't
Raygun's not cheap. New Relic's not cheap. No. Application Insights from Microsoft is, I think, still in preview, so there is no cost. I'm not sure what that'll come at as far as the price point. But when you look at that, what this does, it'll just nicely from NuGet packages add it in. These are all like this, really. So like Raygun.io, they'll add in the NuGet package, and then what you'll have is maybe 2 or 3 lines of code in your, like, say you're doing a web API project and you want to use Raygun. I think it's 2 lines of code in your web API.config under your app start folder, right? And that's going to handle all unmanaged exceptions rather than you having to go into your application underscore unhandled exceptions method in your global ASAX, right? Error handling can be a pain, but what's the big thing about this? These last couple tools I'm mentioning here, anyone that's had a decent sized production website knows that no matter how much testing they do, once it gets out there, your app is going to produce errors that you never saw. It happens every single time. And so using tools like this make those ones that happen specifically in the browser report back to you. Right? A lot of times you can figure out ways to track the ones like through an event log or whatever if it's on the server. But ones that happen on the browser are real tricky to get. And so these go a lot more than like say Google Analytics, where it's really about user experience and SEO type things. This is actually more about tying the entire stack together. One of the reasons like New Relic gets pretty expensive, they're not just concerned with the browser and the web server, but New Relic has components that you can do for your application tier as well as your database tier. So you can go into like the New Relic dashboard and you can say, all right, this call on the JavaScript side in the browser and the Angular app ultimately calls these 15 queries against the database. Well, we need to look at that, right? It's taking too long. All right. That was a very ad hoc presentation from me with my computer's dying on me, so hopefully I think I got through all the points that I originally wanted to. If you guys have any questions, yep.
2. Can you load something like lint.js with that? And the other one was, where was that WPS screen with the warning setting?
The WPF screen, I'll answer first there. That's under Tools, Options, and Debugging, I think. Let me go back to Tools, Options, Debugging, and Output window. And as far as JSLint, yeah, or JSHint, JSLint, there's a JSHint and a lint.
Right. Lint
yeah,
is the one that criticizes.
Correct. Right. Yeah, I'm old school. I did Linux in the 90s with actual lint. So, Yeah, you can definitely do those. There's nothing that'll compete against those in terms of diagnostic pieces, because they'll either produce the code that they inject will either be verified by that, like with either lint or TypeScript or something along those lines, and it's very minimal footprint as far as what's there. So, yeah, I've experienced no problems using those additional tools.
So the options, whatever you showed, right-clicking, right, was that available in all versions of .NET, or is that with Premium or Ultimate?
On the breakpoint right clicks?
Yeah.
I haven't tried it on Visual Studio Pro. I'm not sure if anyone's off or yeah.
It's on
Yeah,
all
it's just something that often gets overlooked. So definitely try to check it out. Yes.
So can you combine, so I usually use conditional, can you combine like when breakpoint is hit and putting conditionals within there? Because I noticed when doing conditionals on like large hoops,
Yeah.
it's very slow to debug, it takes forever to get like this.
Right. I have not had a way to combine those. So in those scenarios, what I end up doing is kind of cheating and sticking in a stupid variable, right? Var x equals 1. And then sticking on another breakpoint that has some kind of interpretation where that would be like maybe 1 would be the when hit, 1 would be the location or print or something like that. It gets tricky because if you have a combination of 1 should continue and 1 shouldn't, like it kind of stinks, right? Because like you'd like to have the combined logic out of that. What I would suggest actually is, so I get a lot of insight to the Microsoft teams when they're working on this stuff, and one of the biggest things that lets them know what the community wants is their user voice. So, you know, if any of you guys have features, go and upvote on those or make your own feature. That would definitely get on the backlog, I think.
Can the load testing tools be used with like a Java application or any other web application, or is it .NET only?
That is a great question. If you're doing load testing against web performance, it will work against the Java app as well. If you're doing what they call a coded UI test, which is another Microsoft naming win, as they regularly have, right? So that one is more akin to something like Selenium, right? And that's a little more fragile and specific. So the coded UI, I don't think that would work with Java, but the web performance would, because that's going to record stuff. Think of the web performance akin to Fiddler, right? So Fiddler is going to manage all your calls coming out of there, out of the web server, and in that scenario, you're going to have that ability. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?